Let's go ahead and talk about standard cost. That's the second half of chapter 21. The standard cost is what we expect a product to cost us. Usually you'll have a standard price and a standard volume that you'll actually be using and producing. We would come up with these through discussions with different managers and different employees. So for standard price of a product that we would purchase, we would talk to our purchasing department. If we're figuring out what our standard quantity is for something that we're producing, we would talk to our manufacturing department. These people would give us insight based on what we've done previously, whether there's new technology coming out that would help us be more efficient. They would help us in establishing these standard prices and quantities. So now, using those standard prices and quantities, that would be what we would use to build our budget. And we would compare those numbers, our standard amounts from their budget, to what the actual is and determine our variances. So the chapter gives a good example for materials and labor variances. Let's go ahead and just look at the materials variance. And I have it here for us to discuss. A stands for actual, S stands for standard. So this was an example with the materials variances for golf clubs, I think, where we'll start with the standard first here. They had expected to produce 3,500, costing $1 a piece for a particular part of the golf club for a total cost of 3,500. Now, what was actual? Well, the actual cost was 37,800. The reason for that is because they produced a little bit more, 3,600 units, and the cost was a little bit more, $1.05. So we just multiplied that out to get that, multiply that out to get that. So our variance here is 280 unfavorable. Okay, so this is just actual quantity times actual price. Standard quantity times standard price gives us the total variance. We'll just put here total. Okay, now if we were going to use this to manage our employees, what would we actually do? Who would we hold responsible for being over budget for this? Well, we don't really know right now. We don't know actually whose fault it was. So that's why we are going to break it apart into a price variance and a quantity variance. So we'll just do this. We'll put a P there and a Q there. Now we're working off of the bottom of page 1 of the study guide and the top of page 2 for the study guide. So make sure that you're looking at that with me. How do we calculate the price variance? Now up here, remember, actual quantity times actual price, standard quantity times standard price. Here for our price variances, we're going to look at actual quantity times actual price. That's the same thing up here, less actual quantity times standard price. Okay, so we're zeroing in on the actual quantity produced, but we're looking at the difference between what we thought we were going to pay versus what we actually paid. Okay, so in this situation here, actual quantity times actual price, we just did that up here, 3,780, minus actual quantity times standard price. What is that? What would that be? Well, our actual quantity is the 3,600. Okay, what is our standard price? We're not using the actual price here, 1.05. We're going to use the standard price over here of 1. So 3,600 times 1, 3,600. What's that amount? 180. Okay, now is this a favorable or an unfavorable variance? Well, what we actually spent here is greater than what the standard would be for our quantity if we use the same amount of quantity. So this is an unfavorable variance. So we would either put a U there or we would show it in brackets. Okay, so we got that. I'm going to go ahead and, for the sake of space, just erase some of this and put that 180 unfavorable over here. Now we need to look at what the quantity variance is. Okay, what's our quantity variance calculation? So we have our actual quantity times our standard price less our standard quantity times our standard price. So now, instead of using this number up here, we're using this number over here. Standard quantity times standard price. That's going to be the second number that we use here. What's the first number? Actual quantity, 3,600, times the standard price is 1. So that'll be 3,600 for that part, less 3,500 times 1, standard quantity, standard price. So basically 3,600 minus 3,500. Now we're looking at 100 here. Now this is also unfavorable because we spent more. We're looking at the actual line here. The actual was greater than our standard would be. So that's an unfavorable variance there as well under the quantity variance. Okay, so the check you have to do here is you have to make sure that both of these together add up to what the total variance is. So you can see that 180 unfavorable, 100 unfavorable equals 280 unfavorable. Now, remember, these go in opposite directions. So if this was actually a favorable variance, 100 favorable, you would need 380 unfavorable over here to make it net to 280 unfavorable. But in this case, they're both going the same way. They're both negatives. So add those negatives together, you got a greater negative up there. So now what do we do with this information here? Our price variance was greater than the quantity variance. So in explaining this right here, we're going to know that the amount that we paid that was greater than what we thought, 1.05, had a more negative impact than the quantity that was used. So we used extra 100 units here. That had a negative variance for 100, but the most costly thing was how much we paid. So we would go back, if we were going to fire one person or write up one person for this mistake, we would write up the purchasing department first because their variance is greater and cause us more unfavorable variance before we would write up the manufacturing department who used too much materials, okay? You can do the same thing with labor variances. There's examples of that on 875. You'll break that apart the same way, having a price variance and a quantity variance. And then there are examples where you can do that for overhead. I'm not going to go through all those different examples here, but you have variable overhead and fixed overhead. You can break variable overhead into a spending variance versus an efficiency variance. And also you can break fixed overhead into the spending variance versus the volume variance. What result of the variance there would be caused by too much production, or greater or under production would be the volume variance there. So see page 879 for examples of those. And we'll continue to work on that in the discussion board and in the homework. Hopefully, once you get the formulas down and you see logically what's going on, these are pretty simple to come up with. Just remember that favorable variances are ones that result in higher net income than we thought. Unfavorable variances that have a lower net income than what we had budgeted.